All right, everyone, let's do this. I am Drew McManus, the author of Adaptistration, and this is my podcast, Shop Talk, where I invite captivating guests to talk about engaging topics connected to the orchestra business. This is the second installment in a series that we've been talking about returning to COVID after very long breaks. You know, orchestras have sometimes taken entire seasons plus off. Some have tried to do as little work as they can and try to keep the musicians engaged to some degree. But regardless if a group is doing work or not, they're in a position to where they're going to have a large number of their musicians that have spent likely the longest stretch of time in their career not playing on stage. And we want to hear actually from the musicians today. And I've taken the time to get representatives from one of each of the three major sections in the orchestra. So we have somebody from strings, somebody from brass, and somebody from woodwinds, and across orchestras of different budget size, and also the opera field, which has very different demands than symphonic playing. So let's meet our interesting guests today. First up is Jon Boen. With a career covering opera, symphonic, chamber, Baroque, solo performing, and even Broadway and jingles, Jon Boen combines these components to offer a unique musical perspective. Widely recognized as one of the most technically commanding performers of the horn, Jon believes his experience at the opera adds a layer of lyricism to his interpretations not commonly found in brass playing today. He has served as the principal horn of the Lyric Opera of Chicago since 1979, a position he secured at the ripe old age of 22. And since 1998, he holds the position of principal horn of the Grant Park Orchestra. Hello, Jon.
Hello.
Thank you for being here today. Next up, we are moving to the woodwind section. We have Chen, a graduate of Curtis Institute of Music. She currently serves as principal bassoon of the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, a position she held since 2017 at the age of 24. Prior to that appointment, Catherine was the assistant principal bassoon with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra at the age of 22. And here's it. What is it with 22 again? Everyone's winning jobs at the same age. Well, working from the belief that music is more than playing the right notes at the right time, Catherine approaches each piece as an opportunity to sing through her instrument and connect with the audience. Hello, Catherine.
Hi, Drew. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here today. And last, we're going to go to the string section. Today we have Yumi Hwang-Williams. Since 2000, Yumi has been concertmaster of the Colorado Symphony and was concertmaster of the Cabrillo Festival Orchestra for 12 years. Strings magazine called Yumi a modern Prometheus who has emerged as a fiery champion of contemporary classical music. Yumi made her debut at the age of 15 as soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and as a graduate of the Curtis Institute of Music, she's known today both for her stylish performances of the classics and her commitment to the works of present-day composers. Yumi plays on a violin made by Carlo Landolfi in Milan circa 1752, and for context, that's the exact same year that Thomas Jefferson was enjoying life as a 9-year-old. Hello, Yumi.
Hi, Drew. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you all for taking your time out today. And for context, for the folks listening, we're chatting on a bright, lovely Sunday afternoon here in Chicago. So again, it's great that everyone's able to set aside some time to really talk about this topic. And let's kind of jump right into it. I mean, let's start with the premise, because I'm definitely beginning this from the perspective of, yes, this is definitely a thing. Musicians coming back from COVID really do have a serious concern about injury. But let's get everyone's thought on that first of all. Is it an over-exaggeration? Is it an oversimplification? Or is it a really genuine concern? And we'll go in reverse order. Let's start with the string section this time. Yumi, what do you think?
Drew, I do think it's a legitimate concern. My orchestra has worked very hard to stay engaged through this unprecedented time. And we've had different groups playing together at different times. In fact, for the last couple of months, we've had a regular schedule now of doing at least 2 projects a month. By the time summer rolls in and we are able to do more full-scale concerts in an outdoor setting, most players will have at least played with the ensemble at some point. So I feel like we're potentially in a slightly better position. But what I will tell you is that several of my colleagues has used this opportunity. I don't know whether it was completely timed this way, but they have had surgeries and I think some pre-existing conditions. I think all this is really about communication with the management and personnel manager and managing everyone's situation. But clearly, yes, with the repertoire and the schedule that we'll be diving into will have consequences that we won't know for months to come.
Well, and I'm curious, if you guys have been at least engaged in some capacity, obviously reduced since the onset of COVID, have your musicians been given the opportunity to opt out due to health and safety concerns during that period?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I have to imagine there are at least some musicians that are going to fall into that category again.
Absolutely.
Well.
Absolutely.
Catherine, how about you in Milwaukee? What's Milwaukee been doing during this time, and what's your view on this as just an issue or not?
So it is a legitimate concern as well, and Milwaukee's sort of in the same position as Colorado Symphony. We just started back up a couple months ago, and before that, we sort of just had an online presence and trying to do small projects here and there. But we're in a very unique position where we just opened a new hall. So it's a completely new venue. And so for all of the musicians, this is going to be our first time trying out the hall. And, the acoustics are sort of unknown. And we're doing small chamber works right now. So each person is sort of having their turn in going into the hall. And we are complying with safety protocols as well. And that's a major issue that management and musicians take very seriously. Actually, last night was our first performance with a small audience in the hall, 200 people, and they were distanced 25 feet away from each other, and they were all spread out across the hall, the balconies, and even the orchestra tier. So, and we're hoping, as we continue getting more used to the hall, we'll also start to expand the number of people that are allowed on stage. So right now, we did a wind quintet last night, but then by June, we're hoping to play Beethoven 7, and hopefully things will be good and by then. But there's just so much uncertainty with all of this too, and musicians are wondering, are things really going to go back to normal after this? And you kind of just have to wait and see.
Well, that's a particularly spectacular perspective that it didn't even occur to me until you mentioned it, which is moving into the new hall. And for folks that aren't familiar with Milwaukee's setup and what the symphony has lived in the Marcus Center for so many years, the Marcus Center is one of those old 1970s kind of like large performing arts venues that you can basically almost see the sound come out about 5 feet past the stage and drop like a brick. So the musicians really have to work. And one of the things moving into a new hall is figuring out exactly where all of those limits are. There's a large testing period in the best of circumstances if you're able to get in months ahead of time and tune the hall and do all this fun stuff. And I think you guys used acoustics as your acoustical consultants for the development of the new hall. And I know those guys as well. Full disclosure, they're clients, but I've followed their projects for years. They are very big on making sure an orchestra can find out what those limits are. But finding out those limits also produces more of a demand on the musicians as well, too, because now they do have to intentionally overplay to see what the limit of the hall is going to be. And it's just kind of in real time flowing through my head here, but I mean, those are all kinds of new considerations to throw into this topic. So
exactly.
Fun, good times in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Well, now let's flip over to the brass section and Jon, because Jon, your regular season gig is at Lyric Opera.
Yes.
And for folks listening to the conversation, it sounds like Milwaukee's done a little bit. Colorado's probably had some work stretched out over the entire period of time. What's the Lyric been doing?
Well, we've had, like everyone, a few online experiences, but starting in I think in February, they started rolling out some live recorded musicians being live, no audience situations. They did some Rossini strings sonatas. I guess there's 6 of them. They did a whole program of those for a small group of string players. Then 2 weeks ago, we recorded some excerpts from Marriage of Figaro and Rake's Progress, 2 productions that were canceled this year. And that was rather interesting because we were on the stage, all spread out. I mean, I was probably 60 feet away from the second bassoon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the acoustics were so odd. And it's in an environment we never play on stage. If we do, there's a shell. I mean, it was so it was I don't know, we'll see what the recording sounds like, but it was really hard to judge. I mean, we're so used to being kind of the sardine can approach to seating where you can't help but notice what the rhythm is of your neighbor, and here you're off like, and here we are like on a football field spread out where so that was interesting. But really reassuring to get back and actually play with people and saying, okay, this still does work. Because for me, it was 11 and a half months since my last performance with others,
wow.
Which, yeah, I mean, the last thing we did, we had the plug pulled on our ring cycle. So you talk about, really a Mount Everest type of, totally prepared, big endurance threshold, the whole thing, and then someone flips a switch and then it's nothing. So yeah, the opera is starting to phase in. They have another couple projects coming up that are small, but we'll gradually include others in the orchestra so that at least there's some contact. And they've been very good with the testing, and obviously they're concerned about aerosols if the bassoon was 60 feet away from where I was sitting. So they've got that spatial thing down. And yeah, we just have to see where it goes and what they have planned for re-entry in September when our season kicks back in. So, but for me, the big thing about being with my job, my career has been very seasonal in the sense that the opera is very intense, but then you have a break, and then you can choose to do other things or do nothing. And then, some people go off to another country and live for 4 or 5 months. And then Grant Park kicks in, and that's another incredibly intense period of time. So I've had this wave through my whole career, these periods of intensity that I have to gauge and prep up for, and then a period of calm where you can relax and kind of regroup and do other things if you choose, and then prepare again. So that I'm kind of used to the cycle, except there's just been a much longer gap in it. But it's for me, my preparation is always repertoire driven, and so obviously I don't have any of that. I have no idea what is going to be programmed. So you just kind of have to go on your own and try to stay in shape and do other projects. So hopefully at some point, that would be something that I hope at some point in management's really give clarity to what, and lead time to what their musicians are expected to be doing in particularly the first month they're back at work. I think that will help everyone's mind get around it and get prepped up to go.
Well, you've hit on a couple of things that I absolutely want to dive into. The first of all, though, is repertoire and planning. Because in our previous show with the music director we had, who's Tito Munoz, who's the music director at Phoenix, and we were talking a good bit about repertoire. And being very cognizant and aware of not programming big works that have a large artistic impact in a positive sense in ticket sales and both, emotional impact with a listener because they want to try to, re-engage as much as possible. But that has to be balanced with this concern over potential injury. And one of the interesting things that I'm getting listening to voices from both the opera and the orchestra world is this does seem to be a little bit more of something that orchestra artistic planners are aware of. Another topic that came up in the previous episode was the degree and frequency of communication with musicians. And for everybody here, just kind of a quick around the board, have your organizations given you at least a roadmap, complete or not, as to what your artistic activity is going to include when you're ramping up back toward regular concert programming? Yumi, how about you first?
Well, I'm a member of the artistic committee.
That helps.
So, so obviously, that committee is the first group that the artistic staff will bring their preliminary programming to us. And we have a chance to discuss it on many levels and sometimes veto, sometimes just tweak it. So we have really good communication on our end. Sometimes we're not allowed to share that information with the rest of the orchestra quite yet because of many factors, but there is a good chain of communication in that respect. Now, that's only the classical programming that we're talking about, but what always happens with us, and I'm sure with other orchestras too, they build a season from the classical subscription packages, and then everything else starts to get added. And sometimes it gets added at the very last minute because there's some potentially lucrative, show. So we're not done. I mean, at any point they can add services if we have them. And I think for me and the artistic committee, the most critical thing that we'll have to watch is how the season continues to balloon as we get going and as the season starts to really ramp up and, what they add on top of it. I think they are very aware that they want to be careful about how they manage as we start, especially because of the variances and protocols too.
Boy, man, there's so many good rabbit holes to jump down there too. But
yes.
I definitely want to give Catherine her input on this too. Where are things in Milwaukee?
Right now, we have not heard anything about next season's programming. And, it's funny, I was sort of in the same boat with Yumi. I was on the artistic liaison committee, no longer this year. But, there have been just infrequent meetings with management because of that uncertainty, and they don't want to divulge until they really know for sure, like 100%, what's going to happen. And so sometimes the musicians had to end up just waiting to hear back from management. And it takes so much planning with all of the variables and factors involved.
Yumi, there was one of the rabbit holes you mentioned that I really want to jump on, because I wished I had thought of this to ask in the artistic decision maker segment of this, which are those programming holes to fill. One of the things that orchestras, it's not a surprise to anyone, use as moneymakers are, non-masterwork kind of programming. But ironically, in many cases anymore, those are some of the more physically demanding shows for musicians to play.
Yes.
There are, if for folks watching this episode, if you ever want to just go to a bar after a concert with musicians, ask string players about all the flats they love playing in the Harry Potter suite, and ask the brass players about pretty much, especially principal brass players, like where Jon is, what they think about anything written by Hwang-Williams. There's no shortage of stuff that are going to be very demanding, but could could end up falling onto musicians in greater quantity because of the demands we're hearing really from everyone, which is we're short-staffed, there's less money, there's less time, there's more pressure. And so your first instinct as an administrator is going to be to, try to infuse as much revenue as possible. Catherine, let's start with you on this. If we're talking about the kind of programming that's non-Masterworks programming, in Milwaukee, if they haven't reached the point to where they're starting to talk about that, since this programming can be more demanding of the musicians, is this a concern that you and your colleagues have, that they could get a substantial amount of very high-pressure, demanding non-Masterworks content as a way to try to make up that revenue?
I think so. Right now, we actually have a pop season throughout this shortened season, but it's actually mostly non-MSO musicians coming to play for the pops. And
that's
I don't know why.
fascinating, a separate conversation all in itself, but go ahead, yes.
Yeah. I think that's also it was part of the safety protocol where we could only play every 2 weeks. And so every other week, some group outside of the MSO could come in and do like a piazzolla or, pop shows. And it's upsetting that, we don't get to play Harry Potter right now, but, I don't know. It is so much more demanding for a brass player to play those pops concerts compared to a wind and a string player. And so I feel like it's not my place to really fully answer that. It is so demanding. And, when we were all in full swing, rehearsing 6 hours a day and then, giving 3 or 4 concerts on the weekends, there was this rhythm in the way we were doing all of this. And so we were used to it because it felt like a very well oiled engine and machine. But then now with the pandemic, there's just been this abrupt stop. And it's been hard for so many musicians. And when we do go back to the full swing of things, it might take some time to really know how much exertion and how hard it will be to really get back into shape. But I hope that most musicians are wise and they really plan. And that's really up to the management telling us early enough so that all musicians, no matter if they've been very motivated throughout this pandemic and have been playing every day or, every now and then, to really be wise in planning on how to get back into shape. And the nice thing too is that we have the summer months off. So I hope that the musicians take that time in the summertime to really plan out their routine so that they're ready for next season.
Well, Jon, speaking of summer, you're not just an opera guy. And, Grant Park is right here in my backyard. I can look out the window and see your venue right there. You guys do a very broad cross-section of programming. You do, Masterworks, pops, you have live movies that you do. I mean, you guys are some of the hardest working musicians in show business during the summer, hands down. We're not far away from that from that point in time where you're hopefully going to find out whether or not there is a season, and if so, what the plans are. First of all, do you guys have any idea as musicians if there is going to be something?
Yes, we do.
Oh.
They are, a lot of the Grant Park situation is linked to the city rules and regulations. And so I think that has been really holding back. For example, usually in February, I get a whole packet of music that I can start working on for the summer. And it's I always look forward to it in the spring because it means, it means spring is actually coming. Weather's going to be warmer, and it gives me great motivation. There's new pieces that I've never heard of before, and there's old friends, and you get to work it up. And so it's artistically, it's a motivating period for me. But they can't do that because they don't know for sure what the limitations are from the city. Now we expect to be doing, the earliest we could get in there is July 1st from what we've been told from the city, which would kind of be perfect for an Independence Day kind of program and be a fun way to bring the audience back, however large they can be, So that's the good news, is they're planning to do something, but it will start in July and probably be a shorter season, because it's not going to extend longer. I'd be very surprised if that happened, but it'd be great to get back there and be doing something. But we don't know how many people can be on stage. So we don't know it's hard to plan repertoire when you don't know what the spatial requirements are. So that's why I'm pretty sure we don't know what's going on. Gotcha.
I didn't even know that they gave you that far in advance, as in February, for what programming is going to be.
Wait, I mean, there's always a few pieces that can shift around, but you get like 90% plus of the layout of the season, and it's incredibly helpful. But that job is so intense that if you don't prepare before the season, you're going to be in trouble trying to add extra practicing, a heavy practicing on top of that schedule. Once you hit the season, it's much more of a maintenance, kind of refine the program of the week and keep it going through. So I feel the same way about the opera too. That's why we always get our music 4 months or so ahead for that season. So you can actually plan out your prep and not get caught in a spot where you could get injured. So, and most of us, like when I was young, no one taught me how to play 4 and 5 hour long operas in school. That is, it's like, are you kidding me? And in my early days at the opera, it was on a 4-horn section too. So I had to ask, I would get an assistant for Wagner or Strauss, but some of that Italian rep is exhausting. And so I had to learn on the spot this whole thing about efficiency of playing and preparation. And, it's like, sort of like Darwinism. If you don't figure it out, your species doesn't go on. So, but that's the way it is, and
artistic Darwinism.
But anyway, so that season at Grant Park is intense. It's a wonderful season. It's exciting, as you said, because we do a lot of interesting rep. They don't have to worry about selling tickets, so they can program adventuresome new pieces. The audience has actually become quite used to looking forward to a new premiere, because they've been cycled through the others, and if they can get up and walk over to the food tent if they don't like a piece, so it's convenient from that sense.
There is one big question that I want to make sure we get to today too, and it is the tough question out of all of this, is the decision that musicians will be put into, whether they're planning for it or not, of, let's say you get back, there is a substantial amount of demanding material that's thrown up into a week that you didn't have a substantial amount of time to prepare for. And since everyone has had this longer stretch of time off, you simply don't know how you as musicians are going to necessarily respond to this. What happens if you're at the point where you're thinking, just like everything's starting to feel overwhelming? Are you going to risk injury over concerns about not bringing your A game, letting your colleagues down, or even being afraid of putting yourself in a position of being targeted for artistic review? Who wants to jump in first with that one?
I will, Drew.
Okay.
I think when you talk about risk, risk management is part of our life, whether we're, insuring our house, or you're, putting on a hedge on a stock trade. It's always, it's this whole idea of to deal with risk management, you have to define, you have to look forward and try to determine what the risk is, at what point is there, what can you do about it, and where's the bottom? And like if a hurricane's coming into Florida, you think, okay, I better get the plywood up on my windows. Don't know if I need all the plywood, but you go ahead and invest in that. You try to find the risk to put it in a box before the event, before the hurricane hits. Maybe it's not enough, but then hopefully you have some insurance. So what's the risk here? I mean, I was thinking about having to go back and playing a Jon Williams program. Now that would get me to go to the hypothetical, in the hurricane scenario, I'd go buy 2 sheets of plywood for every window. I would have to make sure that I got into a large space and did some heavy playing, because I live in a condo downtown, and one of the things I've had, even though I've kept my playing up, it's been at lower volume levels. And when I've been teaching live since the fall. When I'm in my studios, I make sure I put some heavy lifting in, so I keep that. And that would be my biggest concern, would be that so often we go back to work, suddenly the sound encourages us all to get with it and keep up with the sound, and that's where we can really trigger the injury. So I mean, for me, that's where the big risk is, and identifying it is the overuse of the extreme dynamics, and preparing for that by actually doing some heavier lifting in anticipation. So that's my self-insurance part of the risk profile. And then I would have to just hope that the management would be understanding that their risk is that their players will get injured, and then they'll have to hire subs and pay. There'll be more cost involved. So I think the risk is spread between the individual and the managements, and we can take care of our risk, and then management needs to take care of their risk. And hopefully there could be some communication in between about how that is best facilitated. But I've always been of the mindset to take care of my own risk, define my risks, and act accordingly, and see how much I can. And if it's a risky situation, then you have to ask yourself, maybe it's not worth the risk, or find a way to equalize it so that it does become worth the chance.
Well, now that's, again, so fascinating, and so many different directions to go with that. And one of the unfortunate things that we don't have here is a musician who's from a regional per-service orchestra. Because some of the protections that you just mentioned, John, of let's say you're a musician and you do get injured and you go out, you likely have paid, health days, that sick days that you're able to draw on, and even in worst case scenarios, you have disability. Yes. But if you're a per-service musician, it's quite likely you don't even have that security. So it changes your mindset and your decision-making entirely. One of the examples that we talked about in the previous conversation with Tito was the concept of getting back up and running being akin to spring training for yes. baseball and football. And in taking that as a parallel example, in those situations, they encourage obviously the athletes to get back up to their prime and their full speed, but they also know as athletes that if they're approaching a spot or a situation that they can identify only in the moment when it's happening, that's going to potentially injure you because you're not back up to 100%, they can just let it go. And even if it's in a preseason game or something, and people are watching and paying attention, they'll let the error happen. They won't make the hit. They won't do something. And I have yet to encounter an employer or even musicians who are really thinking about that. Of what if you're in an actual, performance situation and you cross that threshold? What's your decision going to be at that point in time? And is your management thinking about how they're going to respond and take that into consideration? Catherine, I'm going to jump to you with that one next. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm also of the same values as John. I like to minimize tail risk, and right now, with everything during these unprecedented times, health is bottom line the most important thing. And So, for, my whole life, it's been really hard to say no, but I think a lot of musicians have that issue of being able to turn down a gig. But I think now with everything in perspective, you have to put your health and your safety first. So there may be a lot of musicians speaking up once we're kind of in full throttle, and they have to really check themselves and see, is this really worth me playing constantly for, what if I need a break because I could really injure myself? And you don't want to re-injure yourself if you've already had an injury. And so I think that's really up to the musician asking themselves that question and really reflecting. And then they have to also be willing to speak up and go to management and just tell them, I'm going to get hurt. And I hope that management is very lenient, and they're very understanding, because our careers are so long. I mean, I'm only kind of at the beginning of my career, and when you think about playing for a few decades, you want to preserve your livelihood as much as you can. And we're not like athletes and dancers where you only have this amount of time for your career and you peak. But this is so important, and people have to really consider this as an important issue.
That's fabulous, and it actually sets up this topic that I want to hand off to Yumi, which is, before I do that, let's just do kind of a quick little, poll here. Is how many of you, if any, are on currently your respective organizations' orchestra committees? Nobody? Catherine, you are.
Oh, just media committee, but not
Media
like
committee,
the orchestra
but
committee.
not the actual like orchestra or negotiation committee.
No.
In this point. So, right. So that's a different point of contact with these questions of saying, yes, we hope management does this, but musicians who are in those positions are in a position to be able to actually potentially influence it. But influence, Yumi, as a concertmaster, you have a unique position in that you typically have more interaction with executive decision makers in an organization, and also board members, than most musicians do. So you're in a position, stop me if this isn't accurate in your scenario, but you're typically in a position to start to begin that conversation and to begin educating and letting those individuals know about these sorts of issues. Is this something that's crossed your mind yet?
Not so much in going forward, but we have, for the last, I want to say, really 10 years even, been reeling about our schedule. Our Colorado Symphony is one of the hardest working, underpaid, and quite fine orchestra there is in the country. And I say that with, like complete factual information. I mean, at one point, in a board meeting, it showed how many concerts we did, and we were right up there with Boston Symphony, and of course our salaries are a fraction of theirs. But the point is we've been on an incredible energy of rebuilding this orchestra for the last 10 years. We had a big, scary bump in the road back in 2011, 2012.
Yep.
And after that, it's been really just making sure that we survive. I think we've used up a couple of our 9 lives. But we, in an incredibly, actually fortunate position as an organization, we've had a lot of wonderful support during the pandemic without begging for it. And the mood in our orchestra is very positive. We just need the city to give us the health protocol and variances so that we can move forward. I mean, we're planning as if the season is going to be normal at this point. We may be shot down, but I want to go back to what Jon said about having to play the first concert as an all Jon Williams program, because we just talked about this, and it never once occurred to me as a string player about the poor brass players. And I'm sort of laughing at myself because, of course, you know, even though the Jon Williams repertoire has ridiculous amount of notes for the violins, especially, and strings, but you know, the big stars are the brass players, and I know that it kills their lips and faces after a full concert of Jon Williams. And so now my next agenda is that I'm going to email the artistic committee and say, are we sure about this? And how can we tweak this program? And do we need extra subs for the brass players? And get that conversation going.
And meanwhile, your texts are blowing up from all of your fellow brass players who are watching this right now.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so things are looking quite good over here and very optimistic. And I just think that we just need a lot of communication, and where we are and how we're going to move forward is because of the work we have been doing so far. I mean, we worked really hard to put ourselves in this position. So we're now in a position of strength. So I think demand and ask that our schedule be more manageable. They knew they were stretching us. We all knew we were overstretched. And we did it anyhow for the sake of the organization. Just so you know, we got to a point at the peak, I think about a year and a half ago or so, where the balance of donation in the budget versus ticket sales were contributing more than 50% of our budget.
That's very unusual compared to
exactly.
most orchestras, right?
Right. I mean but it was at a cost. Mm-hmm. So we had already, I feel like, really peaked and was on the verge of breaking point, in my opinion, my humble opinion. So going forward, this is a great time for us to sort of reset and reevaluate. And we have been doing that. There's been a lot of really positive discussions about our focus and mission for moving forward.
Well, and that's an interesting perspective on this from the vantage point that relationships or any system that's in place are only as good as the people who are going to be involved in them. And right now, the one key thing that I'm hearing from all three of the musicians talking about this specific topic within this larger structure is that we hope our management, we hope our employer, we trust our employer. But that's different than saying, all right, we've now come up with a side letter to our collective bargaining agreement that says for the first 2 months of defined normal concert activity there will be a moratorium on any artistic review initiation. So basically musicians don't have to worry about that as a particular concern moving forward. Stop me if I'm wrong though. Has anyone, in your orchestras even heard of those kinds of conversations happening? No, lots of head shaking no. Yes. And just even as we're talking about this, I think I might get some governance folks on, musicians and maybe some union, to see if it's even on their radar, because frankly, I haven't heard them asking for those sorts of things. Most of it, Yumi?
Drew, the only thing I can add to that is tenure review and tenure status. They have been put on hold for us. Right. Everyone is basically, it's just on a pause button. People who were supposed to have an answer of this year, February is the date for when you say yes or no to a tenure status. We're all told pretty much, I believe, that it's extended I forget if it's another year or 6 months, but there's an extension on that decision. And there was also this idea that no one was going to be terminated during this COVID period. And we just came up with that on our own as an organization, without any real, I don't know, backing of the union or anything, just as an organization.
And for folks listening, because we actually have a lot of listeners to this podcast that aren't insiders, meaning they're not musicians, they're not managers, they are patrons. What Yumi's talking about is the probationary period. When a musician is a finalist in an audition and they've got the job, it isn't immediately you get the job. Yes, you're there, you're in the orchestra, but you're a probationary member for usually 1 to 2 years. Some orchestras have a 3-year process, but very few. And at the end of that process, there's a review, the tenure review component. And if the musician who's on that initial probationary period receives tenure, then they're a fully tenured, vested member of the orchestra. So what Yumi's talking about is, let's say you were a musician who won the audition right before COVID, and your tenure review process was supposed to happen right in the middle of where COVID was supposed to be. Well, how is that going to continue afterwards? Collective bargaining agreements clearly don't have language in them that takes into account something like a major season-killing pandemic and how it's supposed to actually impact that going forward. And now that's a different level of stress entirely for those musicians going through that process. Catherine, you probably, of the 3 folks here, have had the shortest amount of time being a tenured musician. How long have you been tenured in Milwaukee?
So I joined in 2017, and Ado DeVart was the music director then, and he was going to end his directorship at the end of that season. So I actually had to resign from Toronto and join in January because the MSO put in a clause to for new members, if they've worked at least 6 months, then they're eligible for early tenure. And so I was lucky enough to get tenure, get a fast-tracked process. So it counted as my first season, even though it was only 6 months. So I guess this is my 5th season.
Okay. Now
Yeah.
let's extrapolate on that. Let's say in even that fast-tracked season, let's say COVID hit right in the middle of that. Now, how are you going to respond as a musician where your life is on hold a little bit from this unknown to where now you've got this extended period of time of unknown and you haven't been in your regular performance venue? What are you thinking?
Yeah.
Or what do you hope your employer and your union representatives are thinking about you as a musician in that position, going back to work and wanting to get to the end of that tenure process successfully?
I would be thinking, please be understanding of everything that's going on right now. And actually, we've gotten a few new members in the orchestra this season, and they have put in sort of like a pardon, and this season would not count towards their probation period. Because, we just got a new harpist and a tuba player, which are very, very important and vital because it's only one on a part in the orchestra. So we don't want them to feel uncomfortable either and feel like, oh my gosh, this could all just get swept under my feet. And so I would be freaking out if another orchestra didn't have the same pardon. I would probably I would have sleepless nights, nightmares, a lot of anxiety, performance anxiety. I would be really scared because, first of all, you're so isolated, and if you're if you've just moved from a new city and you don't know anybody, you don't have a big support or network. And then, you know, you're being judged on a very short piece, and it's chamber music and it's not orchestra either. So you're even more exposed in that way. And you also don't get to have that normal social interaction that you would typically have when you're in an orchestra, you know, because during breaks you socialize and you get to know people before and after rehearsals. But then with COVID, you know, we're all put in separate rooms and we can't connect like we used to. And so as a new member, you still don't really know anybody in the orchestra.
And I'm going to say every executive director, personnel manager, music director, and union representative should basically rewind about 1 minute and listen to all of that again. Because I think, Catherine, you summed up the very real anxiety that a lot of musicians are going to be going through, that even as we started this conversation, it wasn't even on my mind. It's just popped in as we're having this talk. But these are all things that can't and really shouldn't be left to trust necessarily, because a lot of that anxiety can be alleviated just by having the decision makers on the union and the employer side talk about this and come to a written understanding between it, and then give that to the musicians to allow them to know that it isn't something that they have to just trust and keep them up and potentially impact what their performance is going to be like during that review process. Now to Jon and Yumi, let's flip the script on that. In your positions, especially as principal musicians, you're going to be in a position likely to be individuals who are going to be evaluating probationary musicians who are looking for tenure. Is this something that's crossed your radar yet? And if so, what do you think, Jon?
I really haven't thought about it, but I know that in my mindset would be to be looking for extreme leniency with somebody in extending the period of time. If I received any direction, that would be my response. I would say, hey, you know, this is the time to be generous with how you support your musicians, and you know, that's how I would speak up on it. And I have a feeling most places, I think it would be an extreme situation where that you didn't get some response from, you know, along those lines. I would be surprised. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, Drew, you know the orchestra business more than I do. That there'd be really cut and dried. No, this is what we have to do. I mean, it's like, this is like a once in a century, once in 2 century event here. Let's hope it doesn't happen again in 5 years. But I mean, this is really a unique situation,
well, and as you're saying that, in the back of my head, the snarky / realistic component is thinking, here's 2 organizations that I know, nope, that's not going to happen.
Okay, well, there you go.
And those groups are in right now extraordinarily contentious labor relationships.
Okay.
And these sorts of questions about individual concerns typically get thrown out the door because of just the entrenched perspectives that happen during those periods of time. But yet there are examples, and sure, the Mets name is out there. Big surprise to no one, I'm sure, that's an organization that really likely has not invested as much as other organizations have into stakeholder trust building relationships. And that will definitely have an impact on how things move forward on all of these topics that we're talking about. And we could continue just to go on and on and on with this stuff, but I think this is kind of a good place to start to bring things to a close. But before we do, I want to give everyone the opportunity to offer up some closing remarks. If there's something that popped into your head while we were talking that you didn't get a chance to talk about, now is definitely your time to do that. Catherine, anything?
Well, we talked a lot about physical injuries after COVID, and I also want to briefly just touch up on the emotional aspect of of performing. And I think that a lot of musicians deal with performance anxiety. And prior to the pandemic, when we were constantly playing, it was easier to manage because you were just, on go, and just do it. But now once everybody stopped, and with the hopes that we go back to normal in the future, I worry that the rise of performance anxiety will go up, just because, we haven't been doing it for a while. So I also want to bring that up and talk about that as well. So.
Again, everyone who's a decision maker needs to rewind 30 seconds and listen to that again. I mean, that was a brilliant point to make on this topic. And even when in the last conversation with the music director, he was talking about being very focused and cognizant about trying to address and alleviate those physical concerns, right down to, providing physical therapists, to massage therapists. But I mean, yes, the mental impact is the part that doesn't really get conveyed very well, but can certainly have as much, if not more, long-term effects on a musician. I think that's a big enough topic to come back and have an entirely new discussion just on that with a couple of experts. So thank you for putting that out there. I now have a new topic idea. Jon, how about you? Any final thoughts?
Well, yeah, just kind of following up on what Catherine said. As I mentioned earlier, a couple of weeks ago, I had my first live gig in 11 and a half months. And I was physically prepared. The first day we had reading, but the second day we showed up on our tuxes and the recording button light came on. So there was like no, and then I was ambushed by stress. And, no one ever schedules stress. You don't say like, hey, 2:05 today, I'm going to become no one ever says that. All of a sudden you're owning it, and it's what do you do? And I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and it's occasionally you have to become partners with stress. You can't, if you have a program of being a partnership with the stress, you can manage it. If you think you're just going to conquer it and write it off your list, that's when you get into trouble. So I do daily exercises, right? Or I tried to connect my mind to my body for this very reason. And I kept that up during all of COVID. And I'm really glad I did, because otherwise I might not have been able to get back on track right away. And it was another reminder to me, like, that stuff I do is really important. And I think this could be, particularly for people on tenure, you all of a sudden, it's one thing to have your potential ability presented, but the interference of nerves, which is amplified by the break, can really take your performance level down, and it's below what you can do in a normal situation. And I think that needs to be faced. We need to be given the time to, as you mentioned before, if there's a written agreement that there's a period of time where, you're all safe from review, I think that would really alleviate the potential anxiety level and allow us to kind of regain buoyancy, kind of neutral, return to normal, at least somewhere to normal. But that was the thing that surprised me the most about COVID, was how after 40 years in the business, bam, I was surprised at like the nerves that I was just like flipping the switch back on and digging myself out of that.
Well, I find. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, the difference was the rehearsal was fine, but the live on camera, here we go. That just pushed the elevation of stress up, and then I worked through it and got back to normal.
Which I'm finding as an extraordinary statement, because since I've been fortunate enough to watch you and hear you in a number of live performance situations where you have played material that is going to be technically demanding and require a skill set that would, rattle the foundation of even the best players, and you consistently toss these things off as though they're second nature to you. I mean, if live performances were something that people could bet on, you were the person I would always put my money on. Okay, yeah, fine, not a problem. And to hear if someone in that position is going to have those kind of concerns, how that filters down to everyone else through the field who will have different starting points toward that. That to me seems like something that musician ears should perk up to. And those that are on something like a tenure review committee should be at the very top of their minds as here is something that is different in how we evaluate from pre-COVID. And let's actually have a conversation about that. I think that'd be a great topic for groups to actually dive into. Yumi, let's wrap up with you.
I love what Jon said about allowing stress to be a friend, because it really is a stressful thing we do on stage in real time. And I can think of so many ridiculously stressful situations I have found myself in, and usually of my own making. But I also loved what he said about risk management. I mean, for those of us who've been in the field long enough to have kind of been through a lot and know what's to be expected, you know that preparation can be your biggest friend. And what I found myself before we started going back right after COVID, the first meetings, I knew that my endurance was going to be a huge factor. And for us, we've been doing 90-minute rehearsals sessions, and I find 90-minute sessions actually more difficult than a 2.5-hour session where you actually get a break after about an hour or 45 minutes. For us as string players, we're playing nonstop. So I found myself actually playing through the entire repertoire and seeing how I could handle it. Something that I probably wouldn't really do. I mean, I know the repertoire and know that I can be able to do it without any issues. So I actually worked myself up to be able to play the 90 minutes. And I found that really helpful to me. So I think you have to know your body, know yourself, know your weaknesses. If you have any injuries, pre-existing injuries or maintenance issues, to make sure that you're really listening to your body and allowing yourself to do the things that make you optimal in the performance situation. If it's stretching, if it's yoga, it's regular acupuncture, massage, all those things that we do in order to stay at the top of our game. But yes, the mind-body connection really is the most important barometer that we have for ourselves as musicians.
That is a great place, I think, to leave things, and I'm glad I put the executives at the end of this path, because that's definitely something to incorporate into the larger discussion on their end as well, too, as the people where that buck ultimately stops when it comes to decision making. But until then, I want to thank my guests here, Jon, Yumi, and Catherine, for taking the time out to talk about these issues and being frank, honest, and open to all the topics. I appreciate you spending the time this afternoon, and I hope everybody got as much out of the conversation as everybody had here putting into it. So, take care, everyone, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.